On this Friday afternoon, it's hard to imagine what is going on in another part of the world, Ukraine. And on this, the Orthodox Good Friday, we are mindful of suffering as this world has not been entirely overcome. And as people who are attentive to the news and what's going on in the world, we've seen the invasion of Ukraine from many different angles. But one angle that the media seems to neglect is precisely the religious background to the invasion of Ukraine and the relationship between the Russian Orthodox Church and Vladimir Putin. Well, someone to help us put all of this in perspective is Professor Phil Dorrell of Wofford College. Professor Dorrell is the Associate Professor of Religion at Wofford. He earned his PhD in 2013 from Emory University. His area of specialization is Islamic studies with a secondary area in Eastern Christianity. His dissertation, or a portion of it, was significantly revised and has been published by Edinburgh University Press under the title Islamic Theology in the Turkish Republic. And it treats the Muslim theology in the late Ottoman and early Turkish Empire or early Turkish Republic. And therefore it covers a range of topics within that theology, from the doctrine of God to theological anthropology, nationalism and democracy, secularism, and human rights. In addition to working on the area of Islamic theology, he's also written in other areas such as Orthodox theology. He has a paper forthcoming on theosis, but also on Islamic Christian relations, as well as how to teach Islam against the backdrop of Islamophobia. So with that, we welcome Professor Dorrell. It's good to have you.
Thanks, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate the chance to be here to speak to everybody. So first of all, what I want to tell you is I am here primarily to essentially let you in on a conversation to try and share some insight on what the Russian invasion of Ukraine means to the broader Orthodox Christian community globally. And at the beginning of that conversation, I'll just go ahead and say up front that I have a positionality in this. I'm Eastern Orthodox Christian myself, have been my whole life, from my dad's side of the family, who are all the direct ancestors of immigrants to the United States from what's contemporary Belarus and what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so I have a personal stake in the opinions of global orthodoxy, let's put it that way. And so, like I was being said before, which I appreciate, I do a lot with Eastern Orthodox Muslim relations. And so what I want to say at the beginning here is the conversation I'm going to introduce to you, there is going to be an Eastern Orthodox church before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and there's going to be one after, and they're not going to be the same communities. This is, without question, one of the gravest crises in the history of this faith. And so that's the dimension that I want to sort of introduce, not to the exclusion of other kinds of analyses, but that's the dimension I want to bring out. So the question that I want to answer here, and that I think is answered by a look at the religious ideological dimensions of this, is the Russian invasion of Ukraine cannot be justified morally or strategically. The moral justification for it being absent is, I take for granted. The strategic absence is important. In other words, there's no clear reason how this could benefit the Russian state in any strategic sense. And that was manifest to people of all from the foreign policy community, the intelligence community, the British and the Americans saw this coming, but even they realized that there was no way the Russian state could accomplish its goals of regime change, etc. It was delusional that they thought they could take Kyiv and it would be, etc. So what else is motivating? What else can possibly be used to justify this operation? And so ideology plays a role. How can it be justified at all? How can it even be talked of as a possibility? Certain forms of Orthodox Christian political theology and ideology play a key role in Russian state justification for this and in ideologies that support it and made it seem possible to decision make. Outline here. And then I'll talk about, so what I'll start with is a basic argument that I think is helpful here, and then I'll go through some of the high-level ecclesiastical statements, official discourse by Orthodox Christian leaders around the world to give you a sense of what that global conversation has looked like from the moment of the invasion up until the present. Because it's evolving very quickly, very passionately, and there's just almost too many consequences to think of in the moment, but I'll try and give you some steps. And then also, perhaps more importantly, lots of reading recommendations from specialists, people who work on this area. Because my area is Turkish and Arabic text, so this is a little bit beyond my linguistic competence. So I'm going to give you specialists that I want you to forward thinking with, because I'm using my insights based on their hard work. The way I'll talk about this, my thesis here, is that the war, we can think of it as a catastrophic phase in a centuries-long debate within the Eastern Orthodox Christian community. Particularly catastrophic phase in a much longer conversation. And that conversation is, what should a more modern Orthodox state be? What should governance look like in modern Orthodoxy? Should it be autocratic as in the past, or democratic, which is coded as, quote, Western in Orthodox Christian discourse? And the reason why this is a question is because, to use the English vernacular version of this theology, in Orthodox Christian thought, there is a strong emphasis on the integrity of the Christian faith as something that's preserved by being handed down through an institutional framework that can be traced back to the early church. That was tradition. And so Orthodox Christians, especially in the modern period, speak of the importance of holy tradition as the framework that preserves the integrity of the Christian faith itself, which gives rise to the question that's expressed in English as the distinction between, this is very colloquial, but Orthodox talk this way in English, lowercase tradition, capital T tradition. In other words, what constitutes historical practices that are not part of the integrity of the Christian faith and that can therefore be changed? What constitutes holy tradition, capital T tradition, parts of the faith that should not be changed, no matter what modernity may think about them? Which category does governance and politics fall into? Involved question. Is an Orthodox state part of holy tradition? Do we have to have a state that looks like it did in the past? Or can we have one that follows a different structure, a democratic structure? Because, like, of course, all other religious traditions, or recently, there was no conception of democratic governance as a universally desirable political outcome. And because in Orthodoxy, traditional precedent is extremely important. I mean, that's the precedent that preserves the formulas of the doctrines from the ecumenical councils. The liturgy in Orthodoxy is crucial because it has ancient roots and structures that it preserves. But that traditional emphasis that preserves the faith as we understand it has the byproduct of preserving lots of other things too, like politics, like imperial politics from many centuries ago. So are they part and parcel of what it means to be Orthodox, capital T, or are they incidental, lowercase t, and can therefore be changed to suit different kinds of circumstances? So I also think about this as the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Ukraine's victimization at the hands of the Russian state, is Orthodox democracy under siege by Orthodox autocracy. What I mean by this is, let's think about the capital, Kyiv, the city of Kyiv. What it is now is the modern capital of Ukrainian democracy, the capital of an aspiring democratic state, a state that wholeheartedly believes, at the expense of great sacrifice, in the cultivation of liberal democratic structures, of democratic governance, and the support of international standards of human rights as an aspirational, ethical goal. It's also a place where, depending on the study, but a recent Pew study puts it around, I think, the upper 70s, 75% or so of Ukrainian citizens are Eastern Orthodox Christian. It's a religiously plural state, of course. There are sort of ancient Jewish and Muslim community. The president, as we know, Volodymyr Zelensky, is Jewish, which is also a notable departure from what could be possible in Russia. And the Eastern Orthodox leadership, as I'll give some examples of here in a moment, in Ukraine is very much invested in and argues that contemporary ideals of democracy and freedom are deeply harmonious with an Orthodox Christian religious ethos. Quite willing to fight for that and defend that idea. Modern Ukraine is also, therefore, in some sense, we might think of it as the democratic descendant of Kievan Rus. Kievan Rus was an ancient imperial state. Capital was in Kyiv, where in the year 988, Slavs, the Eastern Slavs, the Rus, who are sort of the people that give rise to both Ukrainian and Russian linguistic and religious traditions, where Eastern Orthodoxy becomes part of the Eastern Slavic culture. It's an enormously important historical event. The baptism of Rus was where, all of East Slavic Orthodoxy traced itself to that event in 988 under Vladimir the Great, Vladimir in contemporary, English and Russian, the Grand Prince of Kyiv. And so the Ukrainian statehood and the Ukrainian conception of the compatibility of orthodoxy and liberal democratic governance in the sense of a democratic system. I'm not talking about American dichotomies between conservative and liberal. Very much at the heart of how religion and faith are talked about in the Ukrainian public sphere. For the Russian state, Kyiv is the mythic center of Orthodox and Russian autocracy. Kirill, the baptism of the Kievan Empire, of the Prince of Kyiv, represents the sanctifying for the Russian state of autocracy as the ideal Orthodox system of governance. In Russian state ideology, which I'll talk more about as I go through this, in Russian state ideology, Kyiv is the sacred model of Orthodox autocracy and is in fact kind of this sacred source of legitimacy for the Russian Empire and the Russian state. Put it bluntly, for Putin, the state next door, and for the Orthodox leaders who support him, is a state that defends democratic structures and orthodoxy and has Kyiv. Supposed to be, for the Russian state, the ancestor of autocratic orthodoxy, the antidote to all things Western, to all things democratic, to all things modern. But there Kyiv is, representing all of those things as harmonious with the Orthodox Church. It represents the absolute, and the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv and the way the Orthodox Church there talks about it represents the antithesis to the kind of religiosity Putin and those around him appeal to. Therefore, deeply threatening to the entire way that he talks about governance and faith and those who support it. So for them, Orthodox Kievan Rus is a sort of sacred ancestor of Russian autocracy, and therefore rightly belongs to them, rightly belongs to the Russians, the Russian state. So a few quick words about Eastern Orthodox Church structure. I've already talked about the importance it places on liturgy and the conciliar documents from the ecumenical councils. We can talk more about the details of that if you'd like, but I want to talk about the structure here in the ecclesial structure because that plays a role. The Eastern Orthodox Church is essentially a community of what are called autocephalous churches, which just means independent churches. Churches that all run their own affairs, are independent from each other, but agree to see each other as part of the same denomination. But they don't have jurisdiction over each other. There's a whole list here. I said I was going to memorize it before I came here. I did not. So we have colored dots. But the most famous ancient ones, Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, are the four most ancient patriarchates of independent churches in the Eastern Orthodox Communion. And then after them, Moscow, the Patriarch of Moscow. And then from those emanate a number of other independent churches, like the Church of Greece, the Church of Poland, that have developed over the centuries and attained their own independent identity by asking for or being granted independence by a mother church, and then getting it, and now they're an independent church by themselves. There's a community of these. And there's one in the United States called the Orthodox Church in America. But it's a lot more complicated than what this is. This is sort of like an idealized representation to give you a sense of the basics here. But what this looks like in practice, and what I want to emphasize for purposes of this discussion, is that it's not just like these boundaries don't correspond perfectly to contemporary national governments. So for instance, this is just the important sort of elements to this discussion. Patriarch in Moscow, with the red dot, has churches in the United States that answer to him, little red open circles. They're not independent, but answer to him. The purple dot, we'll call the Patriarch of Constantinople, also has churches throughout the world that answer to him, including the United States. And then the blue dot over here I have as the Independent Church of Ukraine, a church that was granted, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine in English, that was granted independence by the Patriarch of Constantinople in 2018. A long-standing wish of Ukrainian Orthodox, which means because for many centuries previous, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine had been controlled by the Moscow Patriarch as part of its dependent ecclesial communities, but it wanted independence, many of its representatives. It's granted that independence by the Patriarch of Constantinople in 2018. So now in Ukraine, you have two Orthodox bodies. The little open red circle here, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that answers to Moscow still, technically, and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, independent, is its own patriarchate, its own metropolitan, excuse me. And the metropolitan in the open red circle here answers to the Patriarch of Moscow. So you have this international network of bodies that are connected across national lines that can make these divisions difficult. And so this will just be sort of set up for what I'll talk about now. Finally, this fault line is not just jurisdictional. Sometimes, as the point was made, which I appreciate, in Western media sources, this is seen as a fight over territory, which of course in part it is. But this goes much deeper because the current Patriarch of Constantinople, which is a position that has a special level of prestige in the Eastern Orthodox Church, because it's the mother church of so many others, being the old capital of Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire. Patriarch Bartholomew, ever since he has been patriarch for many, many, many years now, he has articulated a robust and sincere defense of democratization and human rights from an Orthodox perspective. He has taken the public stance for a long time that democratization, the defense of universal human rights, is not just acceptable, but a good from the Orthodox perspective, and he has fought for it. And I think his sincerity there has often come into question unfairly, but he believes in this and has for a long time. And I can talk more about this, but I think it stems from his experience as a religious minority in the modern Turkish state, where he hasn't always had those things. Patriarch in Moscow, Patriarch Kirill, who's been there since 2008, has, from the moment he was enthroned, said, for him, Orthodoxy stands against democracy, against the West, against Western human rights, and he will construct a vision of the church that fights against those things. These two centers of Orthodox power, the two, in fact, in a sense, the two most powerful independent Orthodox churches in the whole communion, have diametrically opposed visions of political community, and they have for over a decade now. And it's now, and like I said, the independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Ukraine was given that independence by Constantinople. And so there is a true fault line along political theology in the Eastern Orthodox Church that has now exploded into catastrophic violence at the part of Russian aggression. So I'm going to share a few statements by hierarchs, and my point here is that, again, because of the hierarchical nature of the church, the way it's structured, these statements mean a lot. They dictate the terms of discourse. They mean a lot to people. I can't speak, of course, for every Orthodox believer. I'm not a sociologist. But this will give you a sense of where the discourse is going, and everything being said in these statements is truly extraordinary by Orthodox standards. Traditionally, at least in the past couple hundred years, Orthodox hierarchs have been very, very wary to speak about political anything. They just don't see themselves that way. They almost never issue social theological documents. It's only been recently that there's been anything like a social theological program at all in the Orthodox Church. So all of these are quite extraordinary, so I'll just take you through some to flesh out this basic sense of a divide between Orthodox political theologies. February 17th, Metropolitan Epiphany of Kyiv is the head of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. The independent Orthodox Church granted its independence by Constantinople a few years ago. This was the Ukrainian Day of National Unity that was announced and promoted by President Zelensky as it became clear the Russians were planning something aggressive in the buildup on the border. And in a speech he gives to the whole country, he says that what he believes in and what he is fighting for is to preserve personal freedom and identity, to protect us from the shackles of totalitarianism. What his church is there to do in Ukraine. Again, representing about half of the Orthodox Christians in the country, which is 75% of the population. The 75% are Orthodox. There's differences on numbers, but a large portion of them are under his spiritual leadership. And then goes on elsewhere, because Christians, Muslims, Jews, faithful of different churches, and those who do not belong to a certain religious community, but believe in good and truth, we are all children of one Ukraine. A very strong, clear affirmation of pluralism and belief of that, and this is an Orthodox hierarch, the head of this church. So that's one particular way of talking about this. And his discourse has only gotten more along those lines as time has gone on, in terms of national solidarity, but not some kind of nationalism, but a national solidarity that embraces all different kinds of worldviews, because, as he says, we prefer freedom and identity to shackles of totalitarianism, clearly referring to Russia. Right after the invasion began, Metropolitan Onufry, who is the head of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, that red circle, the half of the Ukrainian Orthodox that answer to Moscow still, he actually came out against the war quickly, which is quite remarkable, considering that, as we'll see, the person in charge of him, the Patriarch of Moscow, and this is where all the trouble starts, is quite in favor of it. And he said in his statement, "For defending the sovereignty and integrity of Ukraine, we appeal to the President of Russia and ask him to immediately stop the fratricidal war." His was one of those stronger statements to come out, and the fact that he is under the jurisdiction of Moscow, but is in charge of a lot of Orthodox Christians in Ukraine. This was an important step, for sure. And now that analysts who are much closer to this than I am, the consensus seems to be that part of the Ukrainian Orthodox community that is answering to Moscow right now, the clock is going for how long that's going to last. I mean, it's only a matter of time before they refuse to be part of Moscow. In other words, the Russian church was very anxious when Constantinople gave them independence, gave their Ukrainian Orthodox independence. Were afraid that it would cut into their jurisdiction, their power, because the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was actually their largest jurisdiction. But if anything, this war is just going to accelerate that, in ways that can't fully be measured, probably. Kirill of Moscow, the Patriarch of Moscow, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. I want to take a quick second to try and communicate to you how bad this was. This is the second sermon he gave after the invasion began. This, I think, will be remembered as a turning point in modern Orthodoxy because the sermon before was not directly referencing the war. This was where he had his chance to really state his opinion. And people were very anxious. What is he going to say? Is he going to at least call for peace the way that Onufry did, the Metropolitan of Kyiv under Moscow did? But he is in charge of the entire Russian Orthodox Church. And he famously said that the war on Ukraine is part of a larger spiritual struggle of good and evil, with Russia on the side of good, Ukraine on the side of evil. Why? Because Ukraine allows such horrible things as LGBT pride parades and allows for a plural society where that is legally acceptable. And that's exactly what he pointed to, pride parades, as a justification for the invasion of Ukraine. He calls it a defense of Russia from its enemies. It's a sacred duty, what's being done in Ukraine by the Russian army. And, he's just, in every successive sermon, he's just cranked the knob on these themes. They keep going. He has not climbed down from this. If anything, his ideology gets more and more pronounced. Because, I'll point make in a second, he helped build this ideology when he came into power in 2008. April 4th, Archbishop Elpidophoros of America, who is the head of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America a prominent member of the community of the jurisdiction of Constantinople. Himself also a native of the Turkish Republic, from the indigenous Greek Orthodox community there. He is also a famous defender, again, like Constantinople, of democratization, defense of human rights, one of the more famous in the Orthodox world today. And he, in a public address in New York, talked about the responsibility for condoning such unrighteousness, the invasion of Ukraine, rests squarely on the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church, and especially on Patriarch Kirill. It is uncommon, to say the least, for one Orthodox patriarch or one Orthodox ecclesiastical leader to call out by name another one and say, you are deeply at fault here. And so that's one other important step in this process. The Patriarch of the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople himself has said a lot. I mean, I could never possibly summarize all that he has said. He's been a clear opponent of the war from the beginning. He's been opposed to Kirill's illiberalism for a long time. But this was a statement he made at a parish in Istanbul that is being used by Ukrainian Orthodox there right now that he has jurisdiction over. And one quote that just stood out to me, "We Christians believe that the truth is Christ himself, so Christ will free Ukraine, which has the truth on its side." So again, clear statement of where he thinks Orthodox values should be in this, what they're about, and who is threatening them. And it's not the West. It's Kirill and his agenda. And Putin, therefore, of course, as well. So what I want to sort of zero in on now is research that talks about the specific ideology used by the Russian state in this context. And there's different words for this, but the two most common have to do with an idea of Holy Rus, or the ideology of the Russian world. And this is where the conversation in Orthodox political theology with respect to the invasion of Ukraine, this is where the conversation has gone and where I think it's going to keep going, is something talking about these ideologies in particular. So what are these concepts? Where do they come from? This is where I'll start pointing out scholars that you should read, and not me. Father Cyril Hovorun is one of the more famous Orthodox political theologians in the world today, Ukrainian Orthodox priest. He wrote a book called Political Orthodoxies, which was, to my knowledge, the most recent and perhaps the first systematic treatment of Orthodox political theology in the modern period. And he talks about what he calls Orthodox Christian political religion, as specifically the use of Orthodox theology and identity to legitimize state coercion. Legitimize the state to coerce people in its jurisdiction to take its moral view, to follow its moral dictates, etc. In this larger kind of Orthodox political theology that you can find other examples of, or Orthodox political religion, modern Russian version of this refers to concepts like Holy Rus and the Russian world, meaning that Russia has the divine right and duty to defend pure Christian morality from the evil and corrupt West. That Russia has this particular, divinely sanctioned, almost messianic role to defend not just the Orthodox Church, but the world itself in some ways from its contamination by, quote, the West. And that at the top of that list of what the West is, democracy and universal human rights. And therefore a society where the Orthodox Church does not have exclusive jurisdiction over morality, over the morality in the public square. And in pursuing this ideological agenda, the concepts talked about is that modern Russia is a descendant of, quote, Holy Rus, in other words, the holy state of Vladimir of Kyiv, established with the baptism of his people in 988, that in this conception has an unbroken sacred lineage to the Russian state today. And this defense is therefore, can be undertaken by any means necessary, because the threat of Western liberalism to Christianity and traditional morality is existential. It poses an existential threat to everything orthodoxy stands for. And therefore, combating it is not just a duty, not just a sacred duty, but you do whatever you have to do. And this is again why having a proudly democratic state, embracing of universal human rights discourse, and the agenda of democratization with its capital, Kyiv, of old ancient Rus, is incredibly threatening to this entire system. It basically puts forward the argument that none of this history has to be interpreted this way. This right and duty is rooted in this conception in Russia's sacred history, beginning with the baptism of Rus in 988, anti-democratic, anti-secular, and in such a system, non-Russians, non-Orthodox, and other forms of difference, sexual minorities, LGBT persons, at the minimum have to be subdued, have to be controlled. Thus the famous Russian legislation banning, quote, gay propaganda. In other words, banning the freedom of LGBT individuals to exist and have rights in the public sphere. At the minimum. At the maximum, the invasion of a sovereign nation and the committing of atrocities to prosecute this agenda. The second book I want to talk to you about hasn't come out yet, but it'll be here soon, by Christina Stokol and Dmitry Uzlaner, called The Moralist International, Russia in the Global Culture Wars. In other words, talking about the intersection of Orthodox Christian, this ideology and geopolitics. And a line from their research that I want to draw your attention to, that also along these lines, comes out from a Washington Post article just a few days ago. According to its own narrative, Russia is guarding true Christian faith, as embodied in the Eastern Orthodox Church, from Western attempts to distort it. And so this has a geopolitical significance. Whoever is allied with Russia in this global culture war against the expansion of liberal values is its ally. Whoever argues against it is a threat, and Russian Orthodoxy is seen here as a global vanguard of conservative resistance to social liberalism. And Stokol and Uzlaner's book is all about that. Strongly recommend it when it comes out later in the winter. But the piece in the Washington Post is a brilliant summary of their research. So now, the primary form of there's been all kinds of mobilization to respond to this, but again, the one I'm focusing on here, the primary form of mobilization to the political theology of this operation is a response to the Russian world ideology, what's in Russian the Ruski Mir ideology. The ideology that says that the Russian Orthodox Church has a divine duty to ally with the state, align with its coercive apparatus, to control Russia under its conception of morality, and expand that control elsewhere if it feels it's necessary. Especially in territory that it feels it is theirs, the quote Russian world, parts of the Russian-speaking community that belong to it in some way, like Ukraine. Therefore, somehow their ancestral sacred territory. On March 13th, published on an important website that you all should read, that has all the great scholars talking about this issue right now, Public Orthodoxy from the Fordham Orthodox Study Center. Declaration on the Russian World, Ruski Mir Teaching, published on March 13th, which this year was the Sunday of Orthodoxy, a Sunday in Great Lent that commemorates the victory of icon veneration over its abolishing, its restricting in the iconoclastic period of Byzantium, and is now this sort of public celebration in the Orthodox Church of the victory of orthodoxy over heresy. Commemoration of right belief against heresy. So on that day, a large group of international Orthodox theologians published a declaration declaring the Russian world teaching essentially a heresy, and identifying the political theology used to justify the invasion as the Russian world teaching, and outlining its errors, refuting them from traditional Orthodox thought, and signatures on that have just grown ever since. This declaration has had an enormous impact. You might have already heard of it, possibly. And it has begun to steer the conversation to give a framework for discussing the immense danger of having Orthodox theology utilized in this way. Just one quote from a long document that I urge everyone to read. It now exists in a bunch of languages. We reject the Russian world heresy and the shameful actions of the government of Russia in unleashing war against Ukraine, which flows from this vile and indefensible teaching with the connivance of the Russian Orthodox Church as profoundly unorthodox, unchristian, and against humanity. Signed by, every major global English-speaking Orthodox academic, you could think of, except for those under Moscow, I'll point out. And this, again, just one of many statements, but again, Metropolitan Epiphany of Kyiv, primate of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Once this declaration came out, analysis of the Russian world teaching had been going on for many years by Cyril Hoveter and by others who had been talking about how dangerous it could be. And when these specialists, especially, I should point out Dr. Brandon Gallagher from Exeter, who was the primary drafter of this, who had been researching this for a long time, specialist in Russian theology. This denunciation of the motivation for the war as this religious doctrine has now been taken up by Ukrainian religious leaders themselves, which I want to point out. So it began as a global statement, but it is certainly resonating among Ukrainian Orthodox leaders and other faiths there too. So the Metropolitan Epiphany of Kyiv, the head of the Independent Orthodox Church of Ukraine, on April 3rd, the ideology of the Russian world is the same as the ideology of Nazism. It justifies violence, murder, war, and genocide, and must therefore be rejected and condemned in the same way as Nazism was condemned, its ideologists, and its crimes. He's referred to it again since then, but this is one of the stronger statements where he directly refers to the Russian world teaching as part of the root of all this. Later, on a few days later, April 6th, the Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations, an all-religion council, civil society organization in Ukraine that encompasses all the faiths in Ukraine, the Muslim community, the Jewish community, issued their own statement about the Russian world teaching on April 6th. I think it was actually a few days before this, but this is the English version that came out on April 6th. The statement on genocide of the Ukrainian people committed by Russian troops in the Kyiv region. This is, of course, a response to Bucha and the atrocities that have been, reality of which has been multiplying as we become more aware of it. Now, every state in the world should not remain silent. Every state in the world should recognize the genocide of the Ukrainian people during the Russian invasion in 2022 and condemn the ideology of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, as one that is justifying the genocide of peoples and the destruction of entire states. So now, this denunciation of the Russian world ideology, of this particular kind of Orthodox political theology, is denounced by the official representative of all religious groups in Ukraine. Another dimension of this mobilization, a little while ago, shortly before April 13th, a group of Orthodox priests in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, the Ukrainian Orthodox jurisdiction under Moscow, got together and issued a call for a church tribunal of Kirill that could theoretically strip him of his position, condemn him for his role in all this, for his help in constructing this ideology and perpetuating it and using it to justify and support the war in Ukraine. So a few quotes from that. This began a few weeks ago, or a week and a half ago or so, but I just checked this morning, the number of signatures of priests and archpriests is about 450, so it's a not insignificant number. And again, all priests under the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine. We call on the primates of the local Orthodox churches, meaning those autocephalous independent churches around the world, clearly and unequivocally condemn the military aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, to call on the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, to immediately stop the war and liberate all the occupied territories of sovereign Ukraine, consider the public statements of the Moscow Patriarch Kirill regarding the war against Ukraine, and evaluate them in the light of Holy Scripture and the holy tradition, note again, capital T tradition, of the Church. Consider at the pan-Orthodox level the, quote, Russian world doctrine, which has become one of the ideological justifications of the war in Ukraine, of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, which Patriarch Kirill has been promoting for many years, and evaluate this doctrine from the point of view of Orthodox teaching, and in case of condemnation of this doctrine, involve Patriarch Kirill to liability and deprive him of the right to occupy the patriarchal throne. So, the condemnation of the ideological dimension of this as having a religious overtone that is illegal under Orthodox Church teaching, that is heretical, that call, the Russian World Declaration, has reverberated everywhere and is now part of a global discourse in Ukraine, outside Ukraine, to try and address the religious ideological dimensions of this. Another example of this, and this went around, I noticed this on social media from a number of different sources. This is a map of the jurisdictions of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, Moscow Patriarch, that have refused to commemorate Patriarch Kirill in their liturgy, which is a way of formally protesting what he's doing. It's the first step to saying, we don't want to be under you. We don't recognize your authority in some sense. This is an old map. Apparently the number has gone up since then, but we're looking at perhaps 20, 25, somewhere in that neighborhood of jurisdictions within the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that answers to Moscow, beginning to formally renounce Patriarch, not an exact break, but it's the first thing an Orthodox Church does when it wants to condemn somebody. You stop praying for them in the liturgy on Sunday. This also came out just a few days ago, and I just want to sort of, again, highlight the importance of this discourse. Metropolitan Epiphanes on Twitter, and I should say Twitter is the best place to follow this discussion, and if you want suggestions for accounts, I got all of them, so just let me know. I'm happy to introduce you to Orthodox Twitter. It's quite the place. When the Orthodox Church celebrates the feast of the entry of the Lord to Jerusalem, this is of course a little while ago, earlier, Palm Sunday, Russia continues to kill Ukrainians. In Mariupol, Kharkiv, other cities and villages of the unconquered state. Russian peace, this is another way of translating Russian world. Mir means both peace and world in Russian. Russian peace is a war. This doctrine is a war. There is no holy Russia, holy Rus. There is no holy Russia. There is an empire of evil. By their fruits you shall know them. Again, as clear as it can be, the denunciation of the ideological, religious dimensions of what is involved in this invasion. I also want to draw our attention to two more scholars. So I talked about Cyril Hovorun, Christina Stokol, and Dmitry Uslaner. Two other very important books that I want to recommend. And by the way, all four of those scholars, Stokol, Hovorun, Ricard Swartz, and Denisenko on Twitter, great Twitter accounts. Ricard Swartz's book, Between Heaven and Russia, just came out a few weeks ago, a study of how this ideology exists in some American Orthodox communities. Highly recommend it. And then Denisenko's study of the history of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. Again, classic, the only work of its kind. Just want to, highlight their work in anything that these scholars write. Finally, just something to sort of take with you and think about the legacy of Kyiv. I just learned this a few days ago. I thought it was cool, so I put it in my presentation. The coat of arms of the contemporary state of Ukraine is a seal that was used by Volodymyr the Great. Shows up on his coins, minted when he was the Grand Prince of Kyiv. And so the Ukrainian national state today very much ties itself to Rus, to that ancient Orthodox polity. But again, their definition of that legacy is completely different than the way the Russian state talks about it. So whenever I see the symbol now, it reminds me of, this, again, a majority Orthodox society that sees its heritage going all the way back to Rus as something that can be mobilized for democracy, for human rights, and for something different than what we've had in the past. And finally, just again, to sort of close with something I think is interesting or helpful, as soon as the war happened, there were special petitions, special prayers that were written by hierarchs all over the world on behalf of Ukraine, again, except for the Moscow Patriarchate, from Kirill. And this one happens to be my favorite. It's actually the one that was written by the little tiny Orthodox diocese I grew up in, the American Carpatho-Russian Orthodox Diocese of the USA, under the Patriarch of Constantinople, and actually represents the ethnic community I talked about that I have connections to from my ancestors, Ruthenians, Rusians, people that now actually are called Ukrainians, former inhabitants of parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire. And I just like this statement a lot, so I'm going to close with it. And I think the strength of it comes from, this is the jurisdiction of Constantinople, and it comes from people who feel a connection to what's now Ukraine. O God, you are our refuge and strength and a very present help in trouble. Hear our heartfelt supplication on behalf of the people of the country of Ukraine. Protect those in danger with your holy angels and grant them courage. Turn back all manner of attacks. May hostility fade away. Let your peace descend upon the whole lands with the shedding of blood and warfare. Violence, terrorism, tyranny, and all manner of strife may come to a swift end. Enlighten all civil authorities around the world with wisdom to diligently work for reconciliation. Lord of hosts, we have no other help but you in times of distress. Quickly hear us now and have mercy. Amen. So that's how I'll end this, and I'm looking forward to any thoughts or questions you have.
Professor Doral, I'll let you field your own questions.
Sure. What's on your mind? Please, yes.
I just wonder if there's a tension within Russia among the Orthodox of this. There's the rhetoric of moral vanguard, but I wonder if there are people who see through that and say, well, actually, there was all this atheistic drive, and with Gorbachev kind of extending the right hand and kind of co-opting the church as a clear political mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
How do the Orthodox see, how is there division among the Orthodox in Russia between those who are skeptical about what's going on versus those who really believe that this is a moral crusade?
Yes, I think definitely. Again, following research of specialists who are more connected with this, so that's a very good point, absolutely. The division is hard to track because as soon as the war happened, Russia's already hostile media ecosystem just became totalitarian. So it's very difficult to track any kind of opposition to the war. But there's evidence that it exists. So every now and then you'll see a priest give a sermon that goes on YouTube from somewhere in Russia where he denounces it, and then we don't know what happens later. So, I mean, there must be division. There is division. That's a very good point. It is harder to access and track because of the level of repression. And the focus on Kirill is a consequence of the fact that he has actively supported the development of that state and what that means. But you're absolutely right. There's definitely division, but it's hard to see, I think, sometimes. Go forward and move back, yes.
So I'm a stats guy, and when the invasion first happened, it was very much framed as, Putin, the last defender of Christendom, versus Ukraine, a wannabe liberal, democratic, secular nation. I was shocked to find that Ukraine is 85% Christian. Like, it's one of the most Christian countries in the world.
Yeah, 75% Orthodox, 10% Greek Catholic, the Greek Catholic Church of Ukraine.
But then I looked at Russia, and I'm on Wikipedia, and the Christians in Russia, they don't even crack 50. It says 41% Russian Orthodox, 6% other Christians. And then you have this big block of believers, but not adherents of any particular religion.
It's interesting. I think it's hard. It's hard to. I think that the situation in Russia is hard to say. I think from the studies I've seen, the majority of Russians would call themselves Russian Orthodox. What that means in practice is a whole different question. Church attendance in Russia is famously low. Actual practice is famously low in Russia, right now. So I think this is a good point about how among many Russians, to the degree to which that this is a religious question, like I was saying before, for people in these countries, is a question that I'm not fully equipped to deal with. This is why I keep my discourse on this is a global Orthodox theological conversation at the ecclesiastical level that filters down. But you're absolutely right. Again, the degree to which the average Russian supports this for a religious level or considers themselves devout is an important question that we should ask. The crisis that I'm referring to is caused by the fact that the leadership of the Russian church is so profoundly in support of it, and they have immense authority symbolically throughout the whole of the Orthodox world. And so, yeah, I don't want to separate those two questions as being not related, but just to point out that you're both right, that there's got to be a division on the ground. But the crisis is produced by the fact that the division at the top is taking a very strong stance. And that has the potential, I think, to radicalize. I mean, to be frank, that has the potential to radicalize people who may not have thought that way before. But when the head of the Russian Orthodox Church is comfortable speaking in this way to people who do see religion as somehow tied to their national identity, whether or not they practice or not, that's a very, very dangerous situation, I think. Yeah, on the left.
Thanks, Philip, for this. This is something that's been, I'm sure, deeply troubling to all of us, and I appreciate the ways in which you've sort of sketched out the way the Orthodox Church and the autocephalous churches have responded. I wanted to add one other piece to it, and it's not, you didn't mention this, but it's not just an Orthodox problem. This is a world Christian problem. And right now, the World Council of Churches Central Committee meets May 15 through 18. And that's the only body that can actually remove the Russian church. I think there probably will be some sort of move to do that. Ron Williams and others have called for this. Can you give us any thoughts on how we might engage our own communities in advocating? Because obviously we're not going to be able to speak to the Orthodox churches in the way, but we do have voices in the wider ecumenical world.
I think, I mean, that's a good question. I think just support for Ukraine, I mean, for its self-defense, to be frank, even in the foreign policy sense, in the sense that Ukraine is a country that has the right to defend itself. That's sort of, to me, the key plank that outside observers can think hard about, because that's the most urgent, need on the ground, as it were. In the global Christian community, I think to just recognize that Kirill is completely out of line here and should be called out as such. And I think one way to think about this, and I hope the WCC goes the direction you're saying, is to maybe think about in the way that the international community has tried to isolate Putin, to isolate Kirill as well, for the same reasons. And whatever that isolation looks like in the global Christian community is for everyone else to decide, but to see this as a moment to isolate Kirill for his role in this. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was a really fantastic presentation. So commenting a couple of questions that I must, because I met Kirill back in the 90s when I was doing work at Paul Bishop London when he was Anglo-Russian Orthodox liaison.
Right.
Richard Charters always had this very kind of deep voice, and he said, "Look, we're going to meet Kirill. He's the Dark Lord."
I mean, I'll say for all Orthodox leaders, they do dress in a way that,
Yeah, Kirill was scary back then. I mean,
it gives that vibe,
That vibe. But there was always talk of him whether he was a KGB plant. Like, was he basically put in that position and developed his power in uppers? That's always I don't know. Anyway, that was always the story surrounding him. I'm interested in the kind of roots of this debate. Whether you could say a little bit about the kind of roots of this in the kind of very 19th century debate, Russia, the kind of Slavophile as against the more Western leaning. Seems to me there's a very big debate then. People like Solovyev and others trying to develop an Orthodox vision.
Yes.
Russian context and utterly opposed. Right, this is just a kind of intense. So one question is that the other is it an intensification of that 19th century debate? The other question is there any talk of so that in the Council of Constantinople 1873, I think it's the condemnation of Philetism,
right? That's not
as
Philetism,
over-identification of Orthodox identity and national identity.
Yes.
Has that been kind of revived or used?
Right.
Kind of mileage in that?
Yes.
Given that they actually have an official church council which condemns exactly this, unlike us Protestants who could do with such a official document to condemn.
In my whole life as an Orthodox, I have never been engaged in other Christian polemics because we got a lot to deal with ourselves. So I'm not. I'm never a fan of polemicizing against the West. I'm part of the West, thank you very much. These are all amazing questions. So the first one, Kirill is connection to the intelligence service, Soviet intelligence services. From what I understand, any church leader at that time had to be. Whether or not he was, the degree to which he was is a good question, but they all were in they had to report to whatever. So that period, his role then, I think, reminds me a little bit of, say, the Patriarch of Antioch under Assad's Syria. In other words, a situation that he couldn't control then. Frankly, the Patriarch of Antioch has been criticized recently for not talking out against the war in Ukraine, but I don't blame him, frankly, because he didn't invent the Assad regime that predates him by decades, or 1970-71. He has no choice. He didn't create that situation. Kirill did. He comes into power in 2008, and there was a moment where he could easily have said, no, I don't, because his predecessor, Alexei II, did not talk in this way, certainly could have, and was in power when Putin was, and did not speak this way. Kirill's excited to speak this way. So I'm much more, and I think he's been open to condemnation because, not so much for, as you point out, his connections to intelligence services, that he must have had them, but that's a little complicated because, what choice did anyone have then? But now he's getting singled out because we all know he had a choice. And he really is excited to promote what he thinks is this idea. Your second point about is a continuation of 19th century debates. Yes, absolutely. This is Russian theology in the late 19th, early 20th century was the vanguard of Orthodox thought in general, and all these options were there. The conservative Slavophile rejection of the West, and even within Slavophilism, Soloviev, like he says, is an ancestor of or a descendant of Slavophiles in many ways, but he doesn't see that Slavic heritage as inimical to a different kind of political vision necessarily. Sergei Bulgakov famously served in the Duma, etc. So there are absolutely democratic possibilities then alongside these autocratic possibilities. So I think you're absolutely right. It's a descendant of that debate, but unfortunately, as we know, the Soviet Union ended that debate prematurely, and the partisans of that debate who did have a tendency towards democratization, liberalization, human rights, were either killed or exiled. What remained of the church in Russia suffered in the Soviet Union and reemerges, battle-hardened, if you will, and definitely identifies through that traumatic experience the West with what they experienced in the Soviet Union. They see the West and the Soviet repression as somehow kind of atheism connected, even though now the Russian state wants to connect itself to the military glories of the Soviets, like in the World War II, etc. So but I totally agree. It's a continuation of that debate, and just since I pointed out that debate, man, at coffee hour when I was a kid, we talk about the West. That's also what's so frustrating about this, is that to hear people talk like this is like seeing discourse that you've known for forever all of a sudden show up in the most horrific possible ways. So this is an old debate that people in this church have thought about, as long as for a long time. Are we East, are we West, what does that mean, etc. And the third point that you made, oh gosh, I forgot already. Thank you, yes. 1872 Council. So the council in Constantinople in 1872, or 3, I can't remember, condemned, in the context of a dispute with the Bulgarian church, condemns the over-identification of Orthodoxy with an ethnic identity. And that is a helpful resource, and that is the heresy that the Russian World Declaration identifies with Ruski Mir, with the Russian world. So it absolutely leverages that, and I think it's a great idea, and that gets thrown around a lot, and it should be. And I'll also say, I've said before, that ethno-nationalism is the most threatening, the worst form of Orthodox politics of modernity. I think every religious community has particular kinds of political temptations. The Orthodox temptation of modernity is ethno-nationalism. And there's all kinds of structural reasons for why that is, but it's a powerful temptation. And this Russian version of it, as you're saying, is just the latest example of other types of it. And so it gets condemned along those lines. And as you point out, it's very significant that it was Constantinople who made that, alongside the church, but they led that condemnation. And they have seen that as a legacy to build on, to condemn racism, other types of exclusion. So that council in the 1870s becomes a way to say, we do have resources for human rights discourse, racism, ethnocentrism, and that is distinguished from national sovereignty, which of course Ukraine has an absolute right to. And this is also why Ukrainian Orthodox discourse carefully avoids saying, Orthodoxy and Ukrainianists are the same. No, Ukrainianists encompasses lots of different people. The Orthodox Church supports its nation, but that nation includes a lot of different people.
Yeah. And I think that speaks to the point about Russian sense of to be Orthodox, to be Russian, to
Right.
be Russian. I remember having this conversation
Exactly.
with a Greek person. Oh, he said, I'm an atheist communist. I said, oh, he said, I'm a communist. I said, oh, so you're an atheist. He said, well, yes, but I'm really Orthodox. And I'm like,
Yeah, I feel that. I get that.
Well, to be Greek is to be Orthodox, is Orthodox to be Greek. And I said, yeah, that's Philetus.
Yeah,
It's
correct.
heresy. Like,
Well, what did he say to that? What was his reaction to that?
He was like, kind of laugh.
Whatever, yeah, okay.
Sure, but I think that the point about Russian, it doesn't matter if you go to
Right, exactly.
It's irrelevant.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that is something that I'm glad you brought that up, because that's hard for me to explain sometimes to people, is that ethnic category and religious category in the Orthodox context, like you're saying, really are the same.
It's more like being Jewish.
Yes, that has a dimension like that. And so it's a temptation. For instance, this happened in the wars in Yugoslavia, where people were like, oh, it's not a religious war, it's an ethnic. It's like, no. I've said before and I'll say again, the genocide in Bosnia is a deeply serious example of the same kind of ideology that we're seeing again in the Serbian nationalist example. So the West can sometimes, I think the West discourse, not out of ill intent, but dismissed as like, we don't have to think of this as Christian. But it's like, no, in that context, it is. And I don't like it any more than you do, but like in that context, to talk about the nation and the church, you truly can't separate those, because again, in Yugoslavia, that's what made you Orthodox, was Serbian national identity. And I think the Russian case is absolutely going in that direction. And the Ukrainian case is an example where no, the nation can be lots of people, including the Jewish president, to whom we owe loyalty and support as Orthodox. The significance of that, I don't think, should be overlooked either.
All right, we have time, I think, for one more question.
Or I think I saw you first. Yeah, go for it.
Are these, so the different dissensions that you talked about with the various church leaders and also kind of priests sent from various places, even under Moscow, are all of these dissents together of the caliber that they could actually do, that they could actually make a change to Kirill or the Moscow Patriarchate, or are these kind of all individual, voices that are saying things that are true but that don't actually threaten the top?
I think it's a great question. I think in the practical sense, Kirill's fate is downstream of the fate of the Russian state. If Russia's defeated in Ukraine, Kirill might also have some accountability. If they're not, he won't. That's why I said Ukrainian national defense and sovereignty is key. Because as long as Putin's in power, nothing will happen to Kirill. Again, he believes in what he's saying, and he has no reason to change his mind. But, again, the dissent you're talking about is crucial, because it does make the point that this is not a united system inside Russia, this point of view, and the Russian church legacy does not have to be used this way. It can be lots of different things. It doesn't have to mean this. So it's important, but I do think that in practical terms, nothing happens to Kirill with Putin in power, and if Russia does conquer.
On that happy note, thank you.